Something snapped in Las Vegas, something beneath the neon glow. Beneath the fireworks, beneath the billion-dollar spectacle that Formula One tried to project to the world. Something so small, so hidden, so technical, yet so explosively dangerous that it triggered one of the most controversial double disqualifications in recent F1 history. A detail that wasn't supposed to be seen. A detail McLaren hoped no one would catch. A detail the FIA never expected would reach the public. But it did. And the consequences are only beginning. Before we open this vault, before we go into what really happened inside the FIA garage that night, before we uncover the messages, the engineering decisions, the panic, and the political pressure behind the scenes, I need to know one thing. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments, because what we're about to expose resonates far beyond Las Vegas. The Las Vegas Grand Prix was never meant to be a race. It was meant to be a spectacle, a marketing weapon. A billion-dollar commercial designed to sell Formula One to the American mainstream audience. Everything about Vegas was engineered for drama, the lights, the celebrities, the casinos, the show. But in the shadows, beneath the surface, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with the truth. After every race, cars are taken into the FIA technical bay. They are inspected, measured, analyzed, checked against the most precise tolerances in world motorsport. 99% of the time this is routine, boring, predictable, but on that night the routine broke. When an FIA inspector slid the gauge under the McLaren, it didn't move like it should, it didn't glide. It scraped, it caught on something solid, something wrong. He stopped. He lifted the tool. He tilted the chassis slightly and looked again. And what he saw was enough to call 2 more inspectors over. And then a senior official. Because the plank, the most regulated component of the car's underbody, wasn't just worn. It was destroyed. The plank is the ultimate truth teller in Formula One. It can't lie. Teams can hide flexible wings, trick suspensions, suspicious brake migrations, energy deployment secrets, gray area aero tricks. But the plank exposes everything. It tells you mathematically and undeniably how low the car ran. And running low is everything in modern F1. The closer the floor is to the asphalt, the more downforce the car generates. The faster it corners, the more stable it becomes, the lower the drag, the more lap time it finds. Running low is the forbidden fruit, the dream, the temptation. The line between legal performance and illegal gain. And the plank limits that temptation. If it weighs more than allowed, the driver is disqualified, instantly, automatically, without excuses. This is why, when the FIA saw the McLaren planks, alarms went off immediately. This wasn't borderline wear. This wasn't slightly above the threshold. This wasn't a miscalculation. This was catastrophic wear, the kind that happens only when a car runs dangerously low, scraping the ground lap after lap in patterns too consistent to ignore. And here is the part that transforms this from a normal failure into a scandal. Both McLaren cars had the exact same violation. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, same race, same track. Same failure, same damage pattern. That is not coincidence. That is not random. That is not Las Vegas bumps. That is a setup decision. Las Vegas has an unusual surface, extremely smooth, extremely low abrasion, long straights, and very few natural bumps. For engineers, this means one thing. You can lower the car more than normal. You gain downforce for free. You gain cornering speed, you gain traction, you gain straight-line performance. But there is a risk, a massive one. If your calculations are even slightly off, if your ride height predictions fail by 1 to 2 millimeters, if the night temperatures alter the asphalt behavior, the plank will die. And McLaren's did. Was it an accident, or was it a gamble? Insiders whisper that McLaren came into Vegas extremely aggressive. They believed the track was smoother than simulations predicted. They assumed curb usage would be minimal. Their aerodynamic team pushed for the lowest possible baseline ride height. There are even whispers, not public, not confirmed, but circulating within the paddock, that McLaren may have intentionally removed the safety margin that teams normally keep to avoid plank violations. Why? Because McLaren had been one of the strongest teams in the second half of the season, and Vegas looked like the perfect track to gamble everything on ride height. Throughout the weekend, clues were visible, drivers reporting bottoming in high-speed zones, sparks more intense than usual under the McLaren chassis, a strange scraping noise heard during onboard laps, telemetry showing oscillations, and most importantly, team radio warnings. Engineers told drivers to avoid specific curbs, to lift slightly in certain entries, and to stay clean through the sections where plank impact was highest. Analysts suspect these messages weren't about safety. They were warnings about plank wear, because teams monitor plank status in real time using ride height sensors and onboard load analysis. If both cars were wearing the plank too quickly, engineers would know long before the FIA did. So the big question becomes, why did McLaren continue pushing if they knew the plank was dying? That is where this story begins to darken. Some believe McLaren thought the FIA wouldn't check their cars as aggressively in a chaotic event like Las Vegas. Others suggest McLaren assumed the plank would stay just above the limit, but the wear wasn't close. It was extreme. Beyond salvage, beyond interpretation, beyond excuses. And when the FIA confirmed the measurements, there was no debate. No appeals, no mitigation. The ruling was automatic. Disqualified. And that is where the panic began, inside the McLaren garage. Mechanics whispered among themselves. Engineers opened laptops in a hurry. Strategy leaders entered private rooms. A silence spread through the team structure, the same eerie silence that fills a room when something goes very, very wrong. And the strange part? No one acted surprised. Not truly surprised. This wasn't the reaction of a team blindsided by unexpected wear. This was the reaction of a team that knew they had been riding the edge and finally fell off the cliff. What happened in McLaren that weekend was not a random accident. It was a chain reaction of decisions, risks, simulations, miscalculations, and maybe something darker. Because every piece of evidence points to one conclusion: running that low was a choice, and that choice has now exploded. What happened inside the FIA technical bay after the inspectors confirmed the excessive plank wear on both McLarens was nothing short of a controlled meltdown. Not loud, not chaotic in the obvious way, but a silent, suffocating, politically loaded tension, the kind of tension that spreads through a room when everyone understands the magnitude of what has just been found. This wasn't just a violation. This wasn't just a technical failure. This was a potential scandal discovered at the worst possible moment, during the most important commercial race of the season. The FIA knew immediately that whatever they did next would shake things far beyond Las Vegas. They weren't looking at a simple ride height miscalculation. They were looking at evidence that threatened the integrity of the race itself, a race watched by millions, promoted aggressively in the United States, and financed by corporations that expected perfection, not controversy. The plank's condition wasn't subtle. It wasn't ambiguous. It was the kind of wear pattern that forces the FIA to ask questions nobody wants to answer. While inspectors began documenting the wear, photographing the plank, measuring it again and again, checking both cars for consistency, a strange silence fell over the room. Not because the violation was shocking, but because everyone knew how delicate the situation was. Even the FIA officials seemed cautious, as if they were walking on political glass, because disqualifying a team in a small race is one thing. Disqualifying a team in Las Vegas, the showpiece of Formula One's American expansion, is something else entirely. Meanwhile, inside the McLaren garage, the reaction was equally telling. Engineers weren't confused. Mechanics weren't asking how or why. There was no outrage, no disbelief, no dramatic outburst. Instead, there were whispered conversations, heads lowered over laptops, hurried checks of telemetry, and a noticeable avoidance of cameras and journalists. McLaren didn't look shocked. They looked exposed. One insider later described the mood as tense, controlled panic, the kind where everyone tries to look calm while their minds are racing through the possible consequences. Because inside F1 teams, everyone knows the truth. Plank wear doesn't happen by accident. It happens because a car was run too low. And cars don't run too low unless someone chooses to run them that way, whether intentionally or through catastrophic technical miscalculation. As journalists began circulating near the technical bay, rumors spread quickly. First whispers that something's wrong with McLaren, then suggestions that inspectors had found unusual wear. Finally, the nuclear phrase, excessive plank damage. To the trained eye, those three words mean only one thing: illegal ride height. And illegal ride height means only one outcome: disqualification. Teams nearby pretended not to listen. But they were listening. Ferrari engineers exchanged looks. Mercedes staff whispered to one another. Even Red Bull personnel, normally unfazed, walked slower than usual past the FIA bay. Everyone understood the magnitude of what was happening, not because McLaren was in trouble, but because if McLaren was being caught for this, it meant that the FIA was watching closely, and no one was safe. But behind the scenes, something far more interesting was happening. Teams were quietly questioning whether McLaren had been pushing this boundary for weeks, maybe months. Some engineers claimed they had noticed unusual bottoming patterns in previous races. Others suggested McLaren's speed in certain corners seemed suspiciously high for their baseline ride height profiles. And now, with both cars failing the same check in the same way, those suspicions felt validated. Inside the FIA, the panic shifted from technical to political. The officials weren't just confirming a violation, they were preparing for the explosion that would follow. Every word in their internal reports had to be precise. Every measurement had to be repeatable. Every step had to be defensible. Because if McLaren challenged the ruling, and they likely would, the FIA needed ironclad evidence strong enough to withstand media pressure, team pressure, and potentially even legal pressure. What complicated everything was timing. Las Vegas wasn't just another race. It was a high-stakes investment, an American showcase, a corporate parade. The FIA knew that announcing a double disqualification would overshadow the entire event. Sponsors would be furious. Liberty Media would be furious. Broadcasters would be furious. And millions of new American fans might walk away thinking Formula One was just another manipulated sport. So the FIA hesitated. That hesitation wasn't incompetence. It was fear of the consequences, fear of the headlines, fear of the questions that would inevitably follow. And the biggest question of all was this: did McLaren know? The answer, based on the evidence, is almost certainly yes. Because the wear patterns were too consistent, too symmetrical, too extreme. These weren't marks caused by one mistake. They were marks caused by a set-up philosophy, a decision to maximize performance at the risk of legality, a gamble that Vegas's smooth surface would protect the plank enough to get away with it, a gamble that failed spectacularly. Telemetry data would later reveal that both cars showed unusually low peak ride height values during high-speed sections of the circuit. Engineers know how to read these numbers. They know what normal looks like, and this wasn't normal. It was aggressive, it was risky. It was the kind of setup you use when you're chasing ultimate performance and praying the FIA doesn't check too deeply. The radio messages leaked afterward only fueled the suspicion. Instructions like stay off the curbs and keep it clean on entry sound innocent publicly, but inside Formula One, they often mean something else. They mean we're on the edge, the plank is at risk. Don't make it worse. These are the phrases teams use when they fear the FIA's gauge will catch them. And now, with the evidence confirmed and the measurements undeniable, McLaren faced a nightmare scenario, explaining how two of the most monitored cars on the grid managed to obliterate the plank beyond regulation limits without anyone noticing. But the truth is simple. Someone noticed. They just didn't stop it. And that is what makes this scandal bigger than a technical violation, bigger than a setup mistake, bigger than McLaren. This is about a decision that backfired, a decision that exposed vulnerabilities in the team's processes, and a decision that now threatens to unravel even deeper questions inside the sport. When the FIA finally released the official announcement, the double disqualification of Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, the world saw only the surface. Two cars removed from the results, a technical breach, a rule applied, clean, simple, procedural. But the truth behind that announcement was anything but simple. What unfolded behind closed doors was a storm of political pressure, confusion, panic, and quiet calculation, a moment where Formula One was forced to choose between protecting the integrity of the rulebook and protecting the image of the sport. Inside the paddock, reactions were immediate. Some teams pretended to be surprised, but the engineers weren't. They've all seen the signs before. They know what plank wear looks like. They know what illegal ride height looks like. They know what desperation looks like. And even if they won't say it publicly, many suspected McLaren had been flirting with the limit for weeks. What shocked them wasn't the violation, it was the fact that both cars got caught on the same night, in the same race with identical patterns of destruction. The FIA's final report may have sounded clinical: excessive plank wear, non-compliance with Article 3.5.9, disqualification applied, but those few lines hid a deeper truth. The FIA had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming. The plank wasn't just worn, it was annihilated. And once that level of wear is documented, there is no escape, no loophole, no appeal, no negotiation. A disqualification becomes automatic. But the part most fans never saw was the internal debate the FIA faced before making the announcement. Las Vegas wasn't a normal race, it was a financial monster. Millions of dollars in sponsorship deals, a new audience they were desperate to impress. A race sold as the greatest show on earth. Disqualifying two drivers, especially one as popular as Lando Norris, was guaranteed to ignite a firestorm. But they also knew that ignoring the violation would be far worse. It would undermine trust, provoke backlash from rival teams, and expose them to accusations of favoritism. So they chose the rulebook publicly. But behind the scenes, the political cost of that decision was enormous. Meanwhile, McLaren was left scrambling to control the narrative. Their engineers presented explanations, but none of them could erase the fundamental fact. The plank wear was too extreme to be accidental. Was it a miscalculation? Possibly. Was it an aggressive gamble? Almost certainly. But whatever the intention, the execution failed. The setup failed. The safety margin failed. And their performance gain, whether intentional or not, pushed the car outside legal limits. Inside McLaren, there were already whispers of deeper issues, questions about simulation accuracy, questions about aero-dependent ride height, questions about structural flexibility in certain components, questions about the alignment between the engineering team and the strategy team. For a team that had been rising rapidly in performance, this scandal came at the worst possible time, not because of the lost points, but because of what it revealed: vulnerability. At the same time, rumors began to swirl through the paddock. If McLaren was caught, who would be next? Which teams were running close to the limit? Which setups were exploiting gray areas? How many times had teams crossed that line without being caught? That's the dangerous thing about a high-profile disqualification. It doesn't just punish one team. It forces every team to re-examine what they've been doing in the shadows. And this, more than anything else, is why the Las Vegas scandal matters. Not because of McLaren alone, not because of Norris or Piastri, but because it exposed the thin, fragile boundary between innovation and illegality in a sport built on pushing limits. Every team knows that if you're not pushing the limits, you're losing. But Vegas was a reminder of what happens when you push 1 millimeter too far. The FIA's fear was not the scandal itself. Scandals come and go in Formula One. The real fear was the precedent. If McLaren's disqualification forced deeper inspections at future races, more teams could be exposed. If stricter monitoring became the new standard, entire aerodynamic philosophies might collapse. And if the public began to demand transparency, the FIA could lose control of the narrative they've shaped for decades. But in the end, truth is truth. The plank doesn't lie. And whether McLaren gambled recklessly or genuinely miscalculated, the outcome was the same. The evidence was there. The violation was real, and the FIA had to act. As the dust began to settle, the paddock remained divided. Some teams celebrated quietly, Rivals always enjoy seeing a competitor fall. Others worried what this meant for their own setups. Analysts began debating whether McLaren intentionally crossed the line or simply underestimated the Vegas surface. Fans split into camps, those who believed it was cheating and those who believed it was a tragic mistake. But for you watching this investigation unfold, one thing is clear: the truth behind McLaren's disqualification is darker, more complex, and more politically charged than the brief statements released to the public. The FIA didn't just disqualify two cars. They exposed a technical gamble, a strategic misjudgment, and a side of Formula One most fans never get to see, the side where teams chase performance so aggressively that the line between genius and disaster becomes almost invisible. And make no mistake, this isn't the end. More details will leak. More insiders will talk. More controversies will rise from the ashes of this scandal. Because in Formula One, nothing stays buried forever. Not secrets, not mistakes, not violations. If you want to follow every twist of this story, every leak, every hidden detail, every technical revelation, every political move, make sure you're here for the next chapters. Because what's coming next is even darker. And before you go, don't forget to watch the latest videos on the channel. There are investigations, scandals, hidden truths, and stories the FIA would love for you to forget. Click and watch, because everything connects.